Perhaps you just pulled her from the banner, or maybe you have already had her for a while in your bench and you realize that you want to build a physical damage dealer. Currently, as of 1.0, there are not many options for physical break damage. You have Clara, the character is locked behind 5 stars, and the other characters in terms of physicals like Physical MC, Natasha, who are not very adept. In fact, Su Sang is one of my favorite characters in the closed betas, and I like her a lot as well going to official launch. How to build her in terms of a free-to-play team, as well as if you have multiple 5 stars, how would I mix and match to build a strong team for her? Let's check it out. Now, first things first, we must know what makes Su Sang very special is she is very independent in terms of her overall kit. She has self-action advance, she has self speed up as well, and she has damage increase when there are enemies broken by weakness. So it's very independent. She doesn't really need like a dedicated buffer for her to push her up and stuff like that. She moves very quickly already on her own, and she doesn't like play or require, for example, the likes of Tingyun, Bronya to support her as a DPS to do her function as well. So what that means is she actually can play with a lot of other characters that later we'll talk about in a more hyper carry-ish team to be like that support for that in terms of that supporting the single target damage side of things for that team composition as well. So first things first, let's talk in terms of free-to-play team. I think the best character out of all of them to work really well with Su Sang definitely, of course, will be a character like Asta in terms of a total free-to-play team. Asta works very well because she gives her a bit of speed, give her a bit of attack buffing as well. She does use her skill quite often, but she does get it quite back as well. So this character generally is quite skill point neutral, especially with a bit more investment in terms of traces and eidolons as well in terms of the skill point aspect. Asta does like to take a little bit of skill points, but everything she offers other than the fire damage bonus, Su Sang really likes as well. So I would say this is like the supportive offensive support in this slot, and other than that, in the third slot, you could run, for example, if you are of the pre-registration, you could use Serval, a very strong erudition character. You could of course run a character like Ting Xue. I think it's also very strong. For example, if maybe you missed out on the pre-registration rewards, you could run Ting Xue in terms of this slot as well. Other than that, in fact, I think Herta is also pretty decent. She might not be rated highly according to other people. I think it definitely will get you by in the early game. Since this is like a free-to-play team, if you are in the early game, Herta will definitely get you by in for a little bit, especially if you need a bit more ice damage as well. Otherwise, I think out of these three, I do prefer Serval the best out of the three of them. And the last slot here, I think you need a little bit of sustain. I would actually like a character like Natasha in this slot. I think Natasha and Asta are a fantastic combination, and of course the doubling down of physical might not be preferable. In that case, you could of course run a character like March 7th here. I think March 7 is also pretty strong if you wanted to run her in this slot to draw the aggro to herself and also have a bit of ice break damage for your team composition. Generally, I think Natasha is slightly higher than March 7, but both will work fine as well. For any of you who wanted to run Fire MC in this slot, I think that you will then have to swap out, for example, Asta into Natasha to have a bit more sustain, and Fire MC becomes more of like your offensive last slot character in terms of being like a bit more sub DPS in general and not building for full defensive, because in that case you will need more AoE damage coming from this team given that you are lacking an attack buffer like in the second slot here. So after considering that, now let's add in a little bit more gacha and see how things go. I think out of all of them, like the one that attracts me most will probably, let's just move this aside real quick so we don't make it a bit messy. We just make it messy on the side. One character that I definitely would like in the slot number 3 will be a character like Pella. I think Pella's defense break is very strong, does a good amount of AoE damage as well. So this allows you to have your second slot very flexible. You don't really need an attack buffer like Asta. You could, if you wanted to like do even more damage, but this very simply allows you to run a very cheap and effective, for example, Natasha as a sustain. You have Pella here, and of course, you have a more defensive unit in the last slot here as well. I think this is a very solid team composition already. In this sense, I think Fire MC will be much more preferred in this team composition as well, since she can be more focusing, or he or she can be more focused on defensive tricks as well. So I think this will be a pretty solid gacha or a gacha 4-star combination, swapping in Pella. Other options some of you might be wondering about is Tingyun. I think Tingyun is definitely very strong for Su Sang as well. Su Sang does use all of her traits that Tingyun is very well known for in terms of attack buffing, energy restoration, and I don't even want to use the word, but it's like a waste to buff a character like Su Sang because because she's already so independent, doesn't really care too much about this. Rather, a lot of other characters, for example, you have like Jing Yuan, you have Zealer, or even Himiko, for example, who will much prefer the buffs that she offers. She could be used, but I'm just saying that it might be better to run her in the second team as well. So thinking from like a holistic account building point of view, rather than like, yes, this character is going to be the best, so we must put it in the slot number 2. So those are some thoughts that I have as well. Other options, Ireland as well as Hook, more single target in nature, and I don't think really works as well with Susang. You could run them if you wanted to, but we will likely need to move on to the more expensive team. And in terms of the more expensive team for Susang, I think this is where we really see her strengths like flourish, because she's able to carry a lot of hyper carry teams, being a very, very independent single target damage dealer. And of course, the first characters that come to mind will be a character in slot 2, for example. Sorry, I just dragged this by instinct because I was thinking of hyper carry, but really it's a character like, for example, Himiko as well as Jing Yuan right here. So you have in slot 2 a more AoE character, a DPS character, which really wants to be maybe hyper carried a bit more by the rest of the team. Hyper carry means that you're investing a lot of resource into one particular character who's going to be doing the majority of damage. And of course, in slot number 3, you can run a Ting Yun here. And this is why I mentioned that Ting Yun is meant not to buff Susang, but is meant to buff the slot number 2 here, the one that wants to be carried. And Susang generally doesn't take the buffs from Ting Yun directly as well. So I think that is something important to know. So slot 3 here in terms of Susang, and slot 4 generally you want to run a more defensive unit. Out of all of them, I think Natasha probably will be the best 4-star option. In case of this, you could of course run March 7. I made it a bit smaller here, slightly lower priority. Other than that, you have quite a few options. You can, I think the best out of all of them perhaps is Gepard in slot 4. He has a very chunky shield, so I do like this team over here quite a lot as well. Very good chunky shield, as well as drawing aggro away from the rest of them who are a little bit more squishier. So that's like something to consider. You could run Bailu here if you wanted to. Doesn't have drawing aggro though, so they will split the damage roughly evenly, and that's something that you want to know. Fire MC has taunt and aggro drawing, but generally has a very thin shield. So I don't think these 3 will be able to sustain a lot, especially if harder floors in the Memory of Chaos. You'll get quite a bit of damage across the board. So I think those are some options. You could of course run, if you're very, very brave, Luota, who will be released later on as well. He is a more offensive healer as well, so this team will be very, very offensive. You have offensive characters in 4 slots, and I would say that this will be like my ideal recommendation for probably Susang comp in terms of min-maxing the comp that she's in. Other than that, you can run, for example, Asta here, you can run Bronya here as well. I think it's pretty strong. And of course, some of you might be pulling, for example, Kafka later on. I think you can also slot Kafka into this slot. So as you can see, the Susang is so flexible that by now you kind of like get the thought process. This is more of like anyone that does an AoE damage. This one is more like a more damage, like either, for example, dealing more damage or maybe reducing enemy defense. So Pella will also fall in this category right here. You could of course include Welt here, and last slot is really more defensive, and that is like the big picture in terms of how I would phrase it. A lot of you might also be wondering in terms of like a pure physical team. I think she works very well with Clara as well. You could have Clara, for example, in an AoE team composition, and you could run, for example, Natasha in this slot. And once we get a Harmony physical carrier, we could of course put the physical Harmony unit here together with Planetary Rendezvous, the Harmony Light Cone, which allows us to buff physical damage as well. And yeah, other than that, I don't think she works very well with single target hunt characters in the same team, as she does want a bit more AoE damage presence. She works very well individually, as she can build for break effect as well. So if she's the only physical break dealer, it's also perfectly fine. She's very suited for running into like a triple same element plus maybe her as the single unit. A very flexible character. I really like this character a lot as well. And if you found this video helpful, do like and subscribe for more of such future content. I have done like a full build guide videos. You can check it out right here in this video cut, or maybe you can check out these other videos too if you are interested. Thank you so much for watching, and see you in the next video.